Okay, well, thank you very much. I am extremely honoured to be able to speak to such a distinguished audience. So I was asked to talk about Europe and the new face of economic warfare, and obviously this is a little bit different than much of what we have talked about over the last day and a half, because this is not about air power, this is not about the military. Instead, it is about a very, very different aspect of strategic power, which, however, is becoming more and more important. And I think even over the last couple of months, we have seen in the newspaper headlines how it is that this is becoming a crucial aspect of power contention in the modern world. And this is a little bit surprising, because if we want to understand the new face of economic warfare, we have to go back in time a couple of decades to a period when many people thought that war was becoming more and more obsolete. And this is the period of the early 1990s, after the Cold War was over, when the Soviet Union was disintegrating, when it appeared that everybody was converging upon a common set of values, a common set of ways of organising the economy and politics, and everybody was moving towards free markets. And so this not only had consequences at the national level, but it had consequences at the international level too. Because as we began to move towards towards more markets, more free markets, we began to see global changes as well, as we began to see a greater movement towards free flows of information across borders, free flows of finance and money across borders, and much more free and open trade. And all of these things had consequences because they meant that national economies became more and more bound together by these global networks which restructured the international economy, and we restructured the international economy so that what happened in one country was very, very consequential for what happened in other countries too. And we saw these networks tying world economies together, and everybody thought that this was a good thing because it was going to lead to greater efficiency, towards much more opportunities to create money, and towards much more taking advantage of the benefits that markets could operate. So the most famous of these networks, of course, was the internet, which provided for free communications across most of the world in ways that were unprecedented. But we also saw the creation of financial networks, which allowed for cheap and easy transfers of money across borders. And we saw supply chains changing so that manufacturing began to take place not just in one country, but involving chains of suppliers which could come from many, many different countries, each of them supplying a particular component, a particular process which had great efficiency advantages because you were able to take advantage of the world's intellectual abilities, the world's manufacturing abilities, and hence achieve enormous efficiencies of scale. So this resulted in a world which was a world of networks which crossed across borders. And what was interesting was that these networks had some unusual characteristics which I think not many people anticipated, which is that these networks tended to have hubs. For efficiency reasons, it tended to be the case that most of these networks involved some points of the network which became central, partly accidentally, partly as a process of individual decision-making, so that various efficiencies could be achieved. And what you see here is a map of a different kind of network which illustrates this. This is a map of a network of airline connections. This is Delta Airlines and how Delta Airlines works. And you see here that Delta uses a hub and spoke system, so that if, for example, you want to get from Acapulco to Bermuda, you almost certainly have to travel through Atlanta, which is the hub of Delta's network. And this means that on the one hand, Delta is able to take advantage of enormous efficiencies. On the other hand, this hub is a point of vulnerability. If it starts to rain badly in Atlanta so that there's a storm, then Delta's entire airline network becomes incapacitated. There are delays and there are cancellations everywhere. And this is also true on a much larger scale of networks like the internet, networks like financial networks, networks like, in a slightly different way, these supply chains. All of these networks tend to have these hubs and tend to have these vulnerabilities. And if you are thinking about this from a strategic perspective, of course you begin to think about how these vulnerabilities can be weaponized. And it turns out that these hubs, these central points in the network, can become global choke points, which allow for actors who are able to influence these hubs, who are able to affect these hubs in various ways. It allows these actors to then weaponize these hubs and use them in very specific ways against particular adversaries who they want to disadvantage. This is not something that people thought about back in the 1990s when they thought about world networks. They thought that networks were going to achieve efficiencies, but instead these networks turned out to have a variety of systematic vulnerabilities, and over the last 10, 15, 20 years we have been discovering how these vulnerabilities can be used. And this is why this is the new face of economic warfare. Because if you look at traditional economic warfare, which has been there for a long, long time, traditional economic warfare has been about traditional forms of national power. So that it used to be that if, for example, you wanted to exercise economic warfare against an opponent or an adversary, you had a variety of traditional tools. You could enforce export restrictions to effectively make it difficult for these other countries to use high technology goods. This is something that the United States and its allies did against the Soviet Union. You could use economic sanctions. You could have economic sanctions which prevented other countries from exporting to your markets. And if you had a big home market, this might have some economic effects. Or if you were in a situation where there was a strong strategic imperative, you could enforce using various forms of power projection. You could enforce a traditional military blockade on a particular country. Obviously, this was a politically controversial thing to do, and you would only do it in situations of near war. But now, in this world of networks, we have a variety of other ways in which countries can exercise their ability to try to affect adversaries. And they can use networks. They can use these global networks and weaponize these global networks to achieve power consequences that would have been simply inconceivable in the world before the 1990s. So instead of having national sanctions, which are based upon access to national markets, you can use global sanctions to effectively try to apply sanctions on a global level, which make it much, much more difficult for countries or adverse actors to do business at all. You can use network surveillance. When there are these hubs, these choke points in information networks, which a lot of information goes through, you are able to take advantage. If you are in control of one of these hubs, you're able to take advantage of this to look at all of the information and gain strategic and tactical advantages against your adversaries. You can engage in supply chain attacks. You can attack the supply chains of adversaries in various ways to debilitate them. And finally, it is possible to completely cut entire countries, entire adversaries out of global networks, which can have crippling effects for their economies. And over the last couple of decades, we have seen the United States, and to a lesser extent Europe, take advantage of this because, for a variety of historical reasons, most of the hubs in these networks tend to be located in places where the United States and Europe have the ability to control them. But we also see that Europe and the United States, as they have become more dependent upon these global networks, have also developed some internal vulnerabilities which adversaries are increasingly seeking to take advantage of. And so we can see how the first worked if we look at how the United States and Europe weaponized networks over the last couple of decades. If we look at the reasons why Iran came to the negotiating table for the JCPOA on its nuclear program, the major reason why was that the United States and Europe were able very successfully to isolate Iran and Iranian banks from the world financial system. And they were able to do this because of their control of the US dollar, which meant that the US was able to tell banks that if they did business with Iran, they would be cut out of the dollar clearing system, which is a centralized system which the United States has effective control over. And because Europe was able to use the SWIFT financial messaging system, which is one of the cornerstones of the global financial system, and similarly was able to isolate Iran from it. And once Iran was isolated in these ways, it had strong incentives to come to the negotiating table. We also saw how the United States used the structures of the internet and the fact that so much internet communication goes through the United States or through areas or through cables that the United States has access to, use this to exercise extremely widespread forms of internet surveillance, sometimes with the tacit help of the Europeans, sometimes with the active help to achieve a variety of security results. And we've seen how the United States has recently turned to try to block Chinese firms' access to vital technologies. This happened in the so-called ZTE case about 18 months ago, where a major Chinese telecommunications manufacturer was told that it was no longer going to have access to US chips, which for a period looked as if it would effectively mean that that manufacturer was going to go out of business. So these are ways in which Europe and the United States have been able to successfully weaponize these networks against adversaries or other sort of countries in the system who they wish to achieve certain security results against. But we also see how the United States and Europe have become increasingly vulnerable. We see this especially in the area of supply chains, where there is the possibility of surveillance or subversion of components. And as we have seen the massive growth of civilian communication systems, which nonetheless are essential to national security, we have seen many, many possibilities begin to emerge of ways in which components could be subverted so as to have perhaps striking and long-term consequences for the ability of countries such as China to have access to the core of the telecommunication system and be able to exercise their own forms of surveillance and perhaps even their own forms of interdiction under extreme circumstances. We have seen how the internet can be used in ways that disadvantage the United States and Europe, in particular how social media platforms have been weaponized to become ways of spreading disinformation attacks that have specific consequences for democracy and that can target specific weaknesses in democratic systems. And so this has led to a new emerging security debate about how to deal with these problems. And we see how it is that on both sides of this argument, we are seeing how interdependence, the ways in which these different countries have become interlocked together by global networks, is creating a new set of security challenges. And different countries are responding to this in different ways. So yesterday, the Trump administration announced that it was taking action against Huawei. On the one hand, it was going to make it far more difficult for Huawei to supply into US markets. On the other, and much more important over the longer term, the United States is applying a licensing regime to Huawei so that if you want to sell technology to Huawei, you have to get a specific license from the US government, which provides the US government with a way, effectively, of potentially either limiting greatly Huawei's access to key technologies, key chips that it needs to continue, and perhaps even over the short to medium term, threatening Huawei's survival as a business unless China is able to develop alternative sources of supply extremely quickly. But you also see similar dynamics happening on the Chinese side. So this is at the bottom is a quote from a Financial Times article last week describing how Chinese security thinkers are looking to move towards supply chain arrangements which are autonomous and controllable because they believe that the United States is going to seek to use China's vulnerabilities to on various high technology supplies, which China itself is not capable yet of providing, that the United States is going to seek to use these vulnerabilities in order to try to hamper the growth of the Chinese economy, because the United States now sees China not only as a potential threat, but as a strategic competitor which it wants to weaken in as many ways as possible. That is the Chinese perception, and China is beginning to think rapidly and proactively about how to respond to it by developing its own autonomous systems of supply. So this means that we live in a world which is a very, very different world than the world that we have been used to living in. And this has consequences, I think, also for alliance structures and the traditional alliance between the United States and Europe. And we are seeing how it is that increasing disagreements between the United States and Europe very often focus on these kinds of problems. For example, Huawei. United States and Europe have different perceptions of the threat from Chinese telecommunications. European governments have been clear in many cases that they are willing to consider continuing to have Huawei provide, for example, the components for the 5G telephone networks that European states wish to construct. The United States is applying strong pressure against Europe and has said, for example, that members of the Five Eyes Alliance will not be able to share information with the US or get information from the US if they have Huawei components in their national systems because they cannot be trusted. And this is leading to a lot of unhappiness in the US-Europe relationship. We see similar tensions happening over Iran, where the United States has pulled out of the JCPOA and is effectively seeking to use certain aspects of the world financial system in order to try and push European states and European firms to conform with US preferences on Iran. This is something which Europeans have been resisting through a variety of means. And we are likely over the next number of years, very possibly, to see increased disagreements over Russia, where many European countries, such as Germany, are increasingly embracing, for example, Russian energy supplies in ways that the United States finds discomforting. And should the United States move in a new administration towards a more adversarial relationship with Russia, we are likely to see great tensions between Europe and the US over the appropriate means of sanctioning Russia, because what advantages the United States may be to the disadvantage of the European economy. And this may see us moving over the short to medium term from a situation in which the US tends to for example, apply sanctions against European businesses, European banks in order to force them into compliance, into a situation where there's been some discussion in political circles in the United States of weaponizing networks against European allies and effectively applying, under some circumstances, certain kind of sanction capacities against European allied states themselves, should they start to behave in ways that the United States considers to be inimical to its vital security interests. So this is a new and complicated world for alliance structures. This is also, I think, going to present some major challenges for European and other strategic thought over the next couple of decades. This is something that I and my co-author, Abraham Newman, describe in a forthcoming article on what we call weaponized interdependence for international security. And really, I think the lesson that we have is not that either I and Newman or anybody else have any strong, strong set of strategic ideas to bring to the table in a very developed fashion, but that we are only in the beginning stages of beginning to understand what are the new forms of strategic competition that we are going to see in the economic sphere. Because this is quite unlike, for example, the kinds of economic competition that you saw during the Cold War era, when the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies were effectively economically disconnected from each other, with the exception of certain commodity goods such as grain. Now we are in a world where the United States and Europe and China find themselves tied together intimately by these networks in ways which are very, very difficult for them to disentangle each other's economies from each other. So we are in a situation of adversaries, in a sense, being bound together, or being trapped together like scorpions in a bottle, and we don't have any very good sense of what kinds of strategic logics should we adopt in order to figure out what are the appropriate and inappropriate ways of dealing with this. I do think that this presents some particular and interesting challenges to Europe, because Europe, on the one hand, finds itself in an awkward position in that it is intensely distrustful of China, but also is, I think, unhappy and visibly unhappy with the way that the United States is behaving in a quite unilateral way on many aspects of security that Europe considers relevant to its own interests. But on the other hand, Europe does not have itself, I think, a particularly strong strategic sense of how to proceed. Europe has, however, it has developed a set of quite sophisticated tools, regulatory tools, for influencing markets so as to advantage European production. This is one of the quiet stories that people pay little attention to over the last couple of decades, how Europe has used its own regulatory strengths as a means of reshaping global markets to its advantage. What is going to be interesting, I think, is going to be to see whether or not Europe is capable of applying the this set of tools towards strategic world politics, power politics ends, as well as towards the more traditional forms of commercial advantage, which it has tended to prioritise in the past. Thank you very much.